You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. Today, we're going to be talking about ethical excellence. Why do some achieve it and others don't? Our special guest is Heidi Giebel, professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota, only place in the country colder than Texas right now. She is the author of Ethical Excellence, Philosophers, Psychologists, and Real-Life Exemplars Show Us How to Achieve It. This has just been published, 2021, by the Catholic University of America Press. Let's begin, as we always do, with prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful, by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to start, and then Mario will bring us forward, and Christopher Zender will give us a good cuffing, get us back on track, and then, well, we'll just see what happens. Some people, Heidi, if I might, overcome great hardships. They have a kind of a resilience, and they go on to do good things. And other people, with what seems to be a wonderful childhood, go on to do bad things. What are we to make of these reversals?
That's a great question, Jim. And, it's one I've thought about, I've wondered about really a lot. I know people in my own life who had awful childhoods and went on to do fabulous things. And I suppose I probably know a few of the more vanilla, not so good people too, right? And maybe I should start with a disclaimer. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I have no special insight into individual cases. But I can tell you something I noticed when working on this book. So as preparation for the book, and thanks to a modest external grant from the Beacon Project, I had funding to pay apparent moral exemplars to tell me their life stories. So for $300 a pop, people who had won national awards for good behavior, so to speak, long-term, meaningful, impressive service of some sort to their communities. They would tell me their life stories. I used a life story interview protocol from Dan McAdams from the University of Chicago. And so what I noticed with them, what really jumped out at me again, it was a life story interview, right? So we started talking about their childhoods, and there were a few specific questions about childhood experiences. So what jumped out at me was that so many of these people had just terrible childhoods. And, abuse, neglect, violence between their parents, loss of their parents, and you name it, these people experienced it, well over half of them. And, it was almost like the way to make people really, really awesome, ethically speaking, was to traumatize them, right? But you don't want to try that trick at home. So I wasn't sure what to make of that. So with the help of a psychologist friend, I'm a philosopher, I don't specialize in this. I started digging into some of the literature on trauma, and it actually does turn out that post-traumatic growth is more common, significantly more common than post-traumatic stress disorder. Not that you couldn't have both, and some of my interviewees did have both, but even so, trauma more often than leading to this disorder, tended to lead people, maybe the more naturally resilient people. Again, I don't have special insight into that piece, but it led many of these people to go on and grow from that and do awesome things. Of course, trauma can easily lead the other way too, right? For example, the suicide rate is just alarmingly high among combat veterans. So again, you don't actually want to traumatize people in the hope that everything will be great. So anyway, back to your question, how do we encourage the good outcomes rather than the bad ones? Some of my interviewees credited good therapists, and I don't doubt that that's a thing. A few of them who had suffered addictions in their past credited 12-step programs. And again, I have no doubt that those are often effective. But however they got there, right, ultimately each of these people had to make a choice. What were they going to do going forward? Were they going to wallow in self-pity, engage in destructive behavior, or were they going to turn to something more positive and more fulfilling? And of course, these people, they won national awards because they chose the latter. So why, the flip side of your question, why do people with apparently good childhoods turn to evil and destructive behavior? That I really have no special insight into. For one thing, I didn't interview people who had turned out badly. The people got to be my interviewees because they turned out so well. And also just speaking as an ethicist and amateur psychologist, right? So, Socrates famously couldn't make sense of bad behavior, right? He figured it must boil down somehow to ignorance. You must just not know better, because why would anybody in the world choose what they knew darn well was a worse option? So that sort of mystery has been lingering with philosophers for millennia here. So speaking as an ethicist, that's a little more mysterious to me. Speaking as an amateur psychologist, or maybe just psychology fan, that's a little bit more mysterious to me. Sometimes maybe it is a hidden trauma of some sort that doesn't appear on the surface. Maybe it's a chemical imbalance in the brain. I don't know. But again, ultimately, and speaking again as a philosopher, I take it that comes down to their free choice too, right? Ultimately, there's that mystery of human free will. And some people, given all the advantages of the world, will choose not to make good on that, and to do something bad instead. And so that's kind of the downside, I guess. But I find it just a little bit reassuring as a parent. I hope none of my children will turn out horribly, of course. But even if they don't turn out quite the way I'm expecting, I don't necessarily have to ask myself, how did I traumatize them as children? What did I do that they went this way instead of that? Ultimately, it comes down to them. So I guess that's all I have to say on that, unless you have a follow-up.
Well, I have two quick post-its. I don't know if we'll follow ups, and then Mario will get us serious again. You mentioned Socrates. Look at how that kid Callicles, who had a promising beginning, even went to classes with Socrates, turned out to be a real pain in the arse from beginning to end. So that's one example. And then I don't know, on this show we talk about many subjects, and we talk to people in different age cohorts, as they say. You can no longer be in an age group, you have to be in a cohort. So this might not mesh with your cohort. But do you remember a classic show called Leave It to Beaver?
Yes, my kids have even watched it.
Yeah, all right. And do you remember Eddie Haskell?
Yeah.
Yeah. Rumor now is that as a child actor, Mitch McConnell played the role of Eddie Haskell.
Interesting.
It just goes to show you all things could happen coming up. All right, now Mario.
Well, very interesting. I have a question. I don't know if it's a good question, but you are saying that the way that one person was raised doesn't necessarily have bad consequences or good consequences for that matter. And so, and it seems that it's a question of the will. But since we are social creatures, how is it that society itself doesn't influence in a good way or bad way to human behavior? In other words, I'm worried about, let's say, democracy. And the claim goes that democracy will work better with people who are virtuous. So the culture itself counts. But if I'm raised and I'm educated in a family which gave me everything that I needed, and they turn out not well, it seems that culture really is irrelevant. How this individual morality and social morality interact? That's my question.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't want to go so far as to suggest that how you're raised or your culture, your society don't have any influence on how you turn out. And certainly they do. Ultimately, though, like, because we can see children raised in the same family, turning out quite differently, even with apparently the same parenting, the same environment, even identical twins sometimes turning out quite differently. And we can certainly see people in the same society turning out quite differently. I just want to suggest that those aren't the whole story, not that they don't have any influence at all. And clearly, of course, they do. And here, maybe just because I'm a philosopher and sort of a Plato fan, what you say reminds me of Plato's Republic, where he's talking about the personalities matching up with the different types of government, right? So democracy, the second worst type of government ever, right? It tends to make people lax. It tends to make them just want to indiscriminately pursue whatever they happen to desire, their whims. It makes people undisciplined. And, looking around, you might think there's something to that, at least contemporary secular democracy, right? And you might, on the flip side, as you were saying, think, gosh, this would work so much better with virtuous people. as some of, at least of the American founders, certainly seem to think. So, yeah, I don't want to discount the influence that family and society do have, only to suggest that in the end, if you're raised well and you turn out badly anyway, at least a good chunk of that's on you.
Just a short follow-up. I was raised in a different culture where there was no freedom whatsoever, political freedom. And many people tried to do their best in those circumstances and tried to be quote-unquote moral. Some of them succeed. Some of them didn't because they had to survive. And then when you had to survive in a political context, you do certain things that you don't want to do. Understandable. But at the end, those who kept their morals, so to speak, at the end of their life, and I talked to a couple of them, it's anecdotal evidence. They said, well, yes, I tried to be moral. I tried to be what we may call virtuous, but I was not really happy because I didn't have the opportunity to really flourish in this society. So it gave them a kind of stoic meaning of morality, so to speak. I just tried to suffer this, do my best, but ultimately looking back, I see that I was not really happy. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, what would be the role of what we may call happiness? I know that's a very huge topic, but in this virtue ethics, so to speak.
Great. I'm mostly an Aristotelian in that regard. So when you say happiness, when I've got my philosopher hat on, I want to translate it to Aristotle's virtue, or notion rather, of eudaimonia, of the flourishing, well-lived life, right? The excellent life, if you will. And yeah, he acknowledges that there are certain conditions where all the virtue in the world won't quite get you there. If you're perfectly miserable due to external circumstances, if, as you say, you have no freedom, if you're oppressed, or like if just physically you're miserable, you have a really horrible disease that makes you physically miserable all the time, say, or he mentions if you've got no possibility of action, say you're locked in a prison cell and you can't do anything. So you won't be happy in those circumstances in that sense, or even in the shallower psychological sense, right, of subjective well-being. But I think a couple of things we can say are, first, you'll probably still be happier if you're a virtuous person in those circumstances than you would have been without virtue. You'll still be better off, have more subjective well-being, or be closer to flourishing, or whatever notion you put in there. And I think you can also say on an even cheerier side that if you have at least minimally okay circumstances, perhaps in your own life, if you've been miserable, things change so that your circumstances are minimally okay, or maybe we're talking about somebody else with the same virtues and minimally okay circumstances. They've got a really good chance of flourishing, of living a good life with those virtues. And again, in the shallower sense too, they've got a good chance of having more subjective well-being, or even moment to moment, sort of that shallower, pleasant sense of how things are going. Does that help at all?
Yes, thank you.
Christopher, what's your question?
Well, I was just contemplating the fact that virtue is a slippery thing, or what we call being good is a slippery thing. Insofar as I could think, I talk about, when I think of people who suffer trauma, I think of Beethoven. So, Beethoven suffered trauma as a child from a very harsh father. And what he achieved great things, no one would doubt that. unless you're a Mozart fanatic. But he, at the same time, was a very difficult man. He could be very cruel and nasty. So, in that one sense, he seems to achieve a certain goodness. But in another sense, he doesn't achieve that goodness. When we're talking about achieving goodness, what are we talking about? When you think about the virtues, like the 4 cardinal virtues, you really can't be properly brave if you're not temperate. You can't be properly brave or temperate if you're not prudent, right? All the virtues go together. What are we talking about with people doing good things? Are we talking about things which appear to be good, like someone achieving, financial success in life? Even somebody just having a good marriage. To what extent are we? What is the standard we're actually looking for here?
Yeah. So, for purposes of my book, which is about ethical excellence, I'm looking for ethically relevant, specifically virtue relevant, good things. So, what Aristotle would call acts in accordance with virtue. Right. So obviously I can't see into people's psyches. No one can. We've got imperfect views into our own psyches even. So what I used as a proxy, psychologists like that term proxy. What I used as a proxy for virtue for my own project was people winning these awards for significant long-term service to their communities in a meaningful way. And then I would go in and read the description of what that was and basically say, okay, does that sound like consistent action in accordance with virtues? Like generosity would be the most common one for nonprofits, of course, but also justice or sometimes courage. And yeah, as you suggest, that's a limited way to look at it. I think, unfortunately, necessarily so, right? Since we only see the external. And so it could have been that some people who won these awards really were not that awesome on the inside. And just kind of a funny thing, after a while, I realized that what I needed to do, in addition to winning these awards as a proxy for virtue in general, was I needed to take naming your organization after yourself as a proxy for lack of humility. Because I was noticing a really different flavor of interview with people who had named their organizations after themselves versus people who hadn't. It was something that I hadn't anticipated, but once I saw it, it seemed sort of obvious.
Yeah, right. It's interesting because I think of somebody like St. Jerome, who we acknowledge as a saint of the Catholic Church, but yet he was a real ass. by all accounts.
That's pretty strong, Christopher.
It's nowhere near as strong as Comius in his Lives of the Desert Fathers had to say about him. So that's the difficulty is virtue is sometimes difficult to detect, and sometimes you might find somebody who one might consider derelict, but yet have a high degree of virtue, but because of some problems they might have otherwise, some pre-existing conditions, if you will, psychologically, they can't actually achieve the full expression of virtue as we would expect it to be, but yet interiorly be somebody who is even better than somebody who seems to be more along the lines of what we would expect from a virtuous man, at least a successful man.
Right. That actually reminds me of some of Jane Austen's novels. She would sort of try to dig into that sort of veneer of virtue that we try to project versus what's actually going on. And sometimes the more virtuous person wasn't the one who appeared to be more virtuous, from the start. Also reminds me of a conversation that I had with colleagues about a colleague at another institution that we know from the American Catholic Philosophical Association. And someone said, he's a really nice guy. And I objected. I said, no, he's a good man, but he's not a nice man. Think about your interactions you've had with this person. And they all conceded my point.
On the St. Jerome front, One of his letters says, you'll know this letter is from me because of the tone I'm taking in it. And St. Jerome is oftentimes pictured as removing a thorn from the pad of a lion. And some cardinal or other said, it's a good thing he did that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been canonized. I'd like to go on from Aristotle and Socrates to Wittgenstein and psychology. As I recall, at the end of the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein raises the question of why psychology hasn't contributed more. And he says, well, some people will say it's because it's a young science. And he says, well, it's not all that young. Why hasn't it contributed more? And his answer is, it's because what empirical investigation investigates depends on what it takes itself to be investigating. And psychologists don't do the conceptual analysis that's necessary in order for them to go on to do empirical work. On the other hand, you've certainly drawn on the work of psychologists, and you said a number of times that you maybe are a psychology sympathizer, but you're really a philosopher. So how is it that psychology contributes constructively to what you're doing?
Thanks for that question. Maybe first a little bit of a disclaimer. So I've, for the past 10 or 12 years, had a reading group, a moral development reading group with my psychologist colleague. And usually she would pick out the readings. It was psych students who were in our group. And a lot of the time, an unsettling amount of the time, when we would read those psych articles about moral development, I would want to tear my hair out because the psychologists were trying to figure out, okay, does this intervention, does this method help people develop ethically? And they wouldn't bother to define, maybe it didn't occur to them to define, what would count as developing ethically? What sort of change in someone's behavior or personality counts as moral progress, and what sort would count as moral regress or moral stagnation? What's a morally irrelevant sort of change? And so I guess that was maybe my first sort of hint that I wanted to try to bring the empirical work that psychologists do into more conversation, with philosophical work about ethics. So I think we really need more conceptual work, before we even begin trying to do empirical work to see, like if you want to see how to get from point A to point B, maybe psychology can help you out a lot. But first, let's figure out if it's worthwhile to get from point A to point B. And so that's where you need those philosophical traditions that have really thought carefully about what we are as human beings, where we're going, why it's worth getting there. But once you've got that, like once you've sort of got the overall goals and directions you want to take with your moral development, well, then it's time to talk about the how. And that, I take it, is where the empirical research can do us a lot of good. And we have a lot of studies, and psychologists can help us design a lot more studies telling us about the effectiveness, right, of particular techniques in achieving measurable goals. So if you can specify in advance what you're going for, they can help you figure out how to get there. So for example, if you can figure out that gratitude is a really important character trait to develop, well, then maybe you could come up with a list of, what would we take to be observable signs that would indicate that someone has gratitude. And maybe we could do that by observing, or better yet, also asking exceptionally grateful people, what gratitude should look like. And from there, then we can try to come up with some hypotheses about what behaviors or what environments would tend to lead people in that direction of gratitude. And then we can study that empirically. Okay, does this actually work? Do people become more grateful at the end of this process? And so that's roughly what psychologist Robert Emmons, who's kind of the rock star gratitude researcher among the positive psychology people. That's what he does when he studies the effectiveness of things like gratitude journals, which, by the way, are pretty impressive in their effectiveness. Within a couple of weeks, people come out, higher in things like subjective well-being, right? But also the habit of the gratitude starts to sort of stick and bleed over to other areas of their lives. And of course, because moral virtues are habits, research on forming and breaking habits generally, I think, can be really helpful in, furthering our moral development, and also kind of setting our expectations regarding people's moral development, including our own. So we want to challenge ourselves and challenge people we influence to be as good as we possibly can be ethically. But on the other hand, we don't want to expect the humanly impossible. So if I tell myself that, this Lent, I'm going to become the next Mother Teresa. And I'm starting out as I do as a pretty ordinary gal, I'm setting myself up for dismal failure, and maybe even despair that'll leave me worse than I would have been if I just set a more realistic goal for my moral development. So I think it can help a lot there too. Does that make sense?
Yes, it sure does. Mario.
Well, your last assertion just made me think. If we try to be better by looking at a saint and try to imitate that saint who may have lived 100 years ago, and that character was really a saint. But then when we try to do what he did, we fail for a variety of reasons. I have different temperament. I have different emotional characteristic. My strength in that virtue is not like he had. My circumstances are quite different. The political context different. And even though I count on grace, so to speak, it doesn't work, because nature is ultimately perfect. Grace, perfect nature. Now, having said that, don't you think, or I do think, that most of spiritualities have emphasized too much on this type of moralistic approach, that instead of looking at my reality here now, how I experience life, the mystery of life, I'm trying to imitate someone who lived this world, but we have too many differences. And by doing that, I just missing a fundamental claim, which is God is a presence for me. And so I have seen that approach in many people, and that left them with their life destroyed, because they say, I'm out of here. I don't want to follow this because I tried too many times. I'm a failure, and I'm even abandoned faith. I seen a friend of mine, even priest. Don't you think that's we need to, or something need to be said about what you said, integrate psychology, emotional life, the heart, and the mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe it'll be helpful to bring in maybe a philosophical distinction and a psychological one, and we'll see if that helps and where you want to go with it. So I think on the one hand, we don't want to underestimate the importance of role models. And role models can be super helpful in giving us examples of ways that people have lived out virtue, the ethical life, grown in holiness, you name it. But as we're, admiring, maybe emulating those role models, I think we don't want to miss the role part in role models, right? If my roles in life are very different than a particular saint, even though I admire that saint or that moral hero very much, it's not going to be a one-for-one translation, right, from how that saint is behaving in his or her roles to my own roles. So among the many reasons that I, for example, can't become the next Mother Teresa this Lent, is that, my roles in life are quite different from hers, right? I've got 12 kids. I've got a full-time academic job. I've got a husband. My life just in the day-to-day doesn't look much like hers at all. So I very much take your point there. And on the psychology side, one really interesting thing I came across, and I don't remember who wrote it. It was a few years ago in the moral education literature, tried to draw, I think, a really nice distinction between role modeling and hero worship. And the suggestion was, if you're falling into hero worship, where you're just literally in this very rote way trying to do what your moral exemplar did, not only are you likely to fail in that for the reasons you brought up, but them being human beings, they had flaws too, and you're likely to pick up their flaws along with their virtues. So what you want to do in positive role modeling is see if you can extract those virtues, those good qualities that you want to develop, and then think carefully about how those translate into your own situation. And then hopefully that can help us avoid those pitfalls you're talking about.
Thank you.
All right, Christopher, lots to pick up on.
Well, I think it's interesting that Mari was talking about, because when I became a Catholic 30-some years ago, one of the first things I was told, do not imitate the saints. And one of the books I was given was a book by St. Francis de Sales called The Introduction to the Devout Life. And one of the keys in that book is that he tells Philomena, who is writing to devotion is proper to every status of life. It's absurd for, let's say, a mother of a family to have the devotion of a Cistercian, just as it's absurd for a Cistercian to have the devotion of a mother of a family. So I think that tradition has always been there within the faith, is that we don't imitate the saints insofar as we do exactly as they did. I mean, otherwise we'd all have to maybe imitate Blessed Henry Sousa, who wore not only hair shirt but hair pants, slept on a bed of nails, right? So that tradition's always been there. I guess, being that's the case, what is when we're talking about saints right now, what do you think is the role of grace in the moral life? To what degree can we achieve moral excellence without supernatural grace? And what is moral excellence apart from supernatural grace?
That's, on the one hand, a wonderful question, a huge question, and also a really hard question for me to answer as a philosopher. When I was in grad school, I was already married in grad school. We'd been married a year. We had our first son already, and I would talk to my husband frequently about this, mostly because he would occasionally wonder why I was wasting my time in philosophy instead of just being a theologian, where I could could talk about the bigger picture more freely, right? Could talk more about grace and how that functions in the moral life. And like I see the point, right? And I think that ultimately it's all grace, right? We wouldn't be here at all to even be talking about moral excellence, except that in the broadest sense of grace, God has graced us with our very existence, our very lives, our ability to speak and so forth. But maybe backing off to a narrower, more explicit sense of grace, I take it it's a real question, like how far can someone in contemporary secular society get without acknowledging God's grace? And here, I guess, I'm encouraged by those classical wisdom traditions, right? The Platonic, Aristotelian traditions. They're not explicitly theist, but they still have a lot of good conceptual analysis, good advice about what a virtue is, what a habit is, how do we get there. On Plato's side, what is it to achieve justice? What's harmony within our psyche like? Why would we want it? How might we achieve it? I also look at the Confucian tradition in my book, and there again, they have a not explicitly theistic, but strong and pretty well developed virtue tradition. So I think there is some work you can do, certainly, and it's work that I've tried to do in my own book that doesn't appeal very explicitly most of the time, at least to grace, and asks, okay, using these conceptual tools of philosophy, of virtue ethics, using these empirical tools of psychology, and using these role models, these biographies of ethical exemplars. Well, how far can we get? And I think we can get far enough to see the attractiveness of a life of virtue, to be motivated to pursue it, and to get some ways down the road there. Like, ultimately, will we be depending still on grace, even if we don't acknowledge it? Well, for sure. Again, because it's all grace. And maybe just one more thought along the line about the biographies specifically. I didn't screen at all because I wanted this to be a philosophy and psychology book with broad appeal. I didn't screen at all for religious beliefs or traditions. But it turned out, as maybe wouldn't be a shocker to you guys, that the strong majority of my interviewees were strong believers, were Christians. A good half or a little better of them were Catholics, or sadly non-practicing or ex-Catholics, but had been raised Catholic. So I think it's important to notice that grace seemed to have been playing in their lives, even though, again, that's not primarily what my book is about, because I wanted to appeal to the broadest possible audience, including nuns, right? Secular kids in an introductory philosophy class, or just a normal person, not an academic who might pick it up off the shelf.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, when you say it's all grace, in a certain sense it is all grace, but in a certain sense it isn't, right? I mean, it would be in vain to have laws if we didn't have some hope that people could at least become continent, right? And it would be in vain to even raise our children with certain moral habits if all it took was prayer and sacraments. We know it doesn't. It takes habitual action. And so I think interesting in this regard is that the tradition has a notion of pre-evangelization. And part of pre-evangelization is to encourage virtue in any way you can. And I mean, obviously it's the case. There are virtuous pagans, and I don't think it's all because they were secret Catholics or something. But that kind of notion of pre-evangelization, which applies to the moral life, applies to the political life, and those types of things, to remove those hindrances, right? To remove the hindrances to grace. Because that's one aspect is that grace works upon us, but yet it doesn't work upon us if we have a wall built up against it. And sometimes remove that wall, you do very natural, non-supernatural things.
Right. I like that way of putting it. And I guess to bring it back around to the beginning of my answer, that was a good chunk of my answer to my husband when he asked why I was messing around with philosophy and not going to theology. I wanted to do some pre-evangelization of 18-year-old college freshmen. I originally wanted to be a missionary and go off to some developing country, and he thought that was not a good place to raise a family. And so he talked me into being a missionary to the mission field of college freshmen. And pre-evangelization.
You could have told him too, in order to be a decent theologian, I have to be a decent philosopher.
I could have. That wasn't foremost in my mind at the time, but yeah, especially now that I teach seminarians and have colleagues who are theologians, I definitely see the strength of that argument as well.
You began with a Lenten resolution that would be ill-advised. And I found myself in a similar situation. It was just yesterday, the first day before Lent, that I was toying with the idea of, for Lent, giving up rants.
That would have been an act of charity.
I made a similar mistake with New Year's resolution. I was going to quit all my vices. And then my wife reminded me a couple days later that no one really likes a quitter. So I decided to choose one vice and work on that. But getting back to the rants, and hoping not to fall into a rant this time around. Back in the day, 1918, Bertrand Russell wrote a famous paper about cause. And we've been talking about causes and reasons in terms of how they come into play in moral education and ethical development. And at the beginning of his paper, 1918, Russell said that trying to understand things in terms of causes is a mistake. And we've come to see that this is a mistake as we've come to have a more and more advanced metaphysics. And he says we finally have to realize that causality and theories of causality are mistaken, and we ought not to cling to them. And to cling to them would be like clinging to the monarchy. Here he's writing in England. It would be like clinging to the monarchy under the false apprehension that at the very least it seemed to do no harm. Now, those of us who've been following the crown might not have that pre-assumption about the monarchy. Now, I haven't yet begun to rant, but you might be getting suspicious at this stage. One of my all-time favorite philosophers is Elizabeth Anscombe. And Anscombe said that well before we have any theory of causality, we're aware of instances of causal interaction. And she talked about kneading dough and breaking windows and playing billiards, we have all these particular experiences of causality. And she said, we could manage very well with these particular experiences of causality without ever even trying to develop a broad theory of causality. Now, that's not an aid of a rant, it's an aid of a contrast or a comparison. Here's the comparison. Ordinary folks, as you would call them. Never met any myself, but that's because I've hung out with a bad crowd. Ordinary folks talk about willpower and grit and stick-to-itiveness and having a heart. And evangelicals talk about being convicted. And they're not speaking of crimes, right? Being convicted. Now, are these terms that ordinary folks use, willpower, grit, stick-to-itiveness, having a heart, are they folk ethic terms that we need to get beyond and have a much larger view? Or are they building blocks which we can't really eliminate? We can shed some light on, but they're here to stay. So back to causality, we're very much aware of the causal mechanism of cutting and pasting. We do it all the time. Well, when it comes to everyday, ordinary life, what's the role that these everyday, ordinary life ethical concepts play and should play?
Yeah. Between the two options you mentioned, I definitely think closer to building blocks, right? So I certainly don't want to dismiss out of hand people's sort of ordinary or common sense ethical concepts. Usually when we talk about things, and a lot of people are talking about them, usually it means there's something there to talk about, right? Usually they're not just making this stuff up. So my own approach has been, as much as I can, and again, I guess I'm taking inspiration from Aristotle here, to see how these notions might map onto, and in some cases explain or even extend the existing ethical theory that I'm trying to work with. So you mentioned willpower, which I think is actually a great example. So psychologist Roy Baumeister, who literally wrote the book on willpower, he found that we tend to draw on the same, or at least apparently same source of willpower for several things. So focusing our thoughts, avoiding distractions, getting past negative emotions, usually ironically by seeking distractions, sticking to difficult or boring tasks. So maybe that's where the stick-to-itiveness might come in. And of course, resisting temptation. So those last two roles for willpower, sticking to the tasks and resisting temptation, they actually map pretty nicely onto the moral virtues of perseverance and temperance. So I think willpower can be a nice conversational starting point to lead into discussion of those virtues. So of course, it's not identical with either of those virtues. And it's a closer philosophical analog. I take it to the Aristotelian notion of continence, when you're making yourself do the right or the good or the rational thing. But still, they give us a nice lead in to discussing, okay, what would it be like if those sorts of things were fully habitual and we actually liked them and didn't have to make ourselves act this way. So again, while it's not identical with those virtues, it can give us helpful insight into how to develop them. And it also On the extension side, and Baumeister's willpower research, I think, gives an intriguing suggestion about the way in which the unity of the virtues could, at least in part, work, right? It suggests that our temperance and our perseverance actually might be pretty closely related in this psychological sense. And we could maybe add that to our conception, or our conceptual senses. Similarly, having a heart. And, it's not philosophical jargon, but it sounds a lot like compassion, right? Which is closely linked to virtues like generosity in the Aristotelian tradition, or benevolence, which is a big virtue in the Confucian tradition. And so in my own work, the more connections I can make with normal people, again, meaning pretty much everybody except academics, the more connections I can make with how people talk in real life, the better. And so I've tried to get better and better at that. And sometimes I'll even find myself asking my husband or my students or my non-academic friends, like, do normal people talk like this? Does this word mean what I think it means? Because, I want to make those translations as easy and natural as possible so people can actually benefit from them.
Thank you. I like to see the urge to unify. We're coming close to the end. Mario, Christopher, other question, reflection, either of you, both of you?
I have I don't know if it's a comment, or I'm grateful because you mentioned very often that moral excellence come from, or at least you draw from, interviewing people in their own life, biographies. And my experience precisely was the opposite. When I was studying philosophy, generally classes were a bunch of claims made by someone. And I had one professor who said once, if you want to understand a Kierkegaard, just don't read his treatise, rather read his biography. Mm. So, and I think that is a very good advice that I received, where you see the intellectual in that case, or the person incarnated in real life. And that resonates because one generally identifies with this character. And I think that helped me, and I think many people help to relate to what is at stake there, and not just a claim that you need to apply to your unique life. Thank you.
And Christopher?
I don't think I have anything to say, believe it or not. So I'll leave it up to you, Jim.
I had thought to ask, because I've always been puzzled by that everyday term, snarky. Whether we could say that Callicles was snarky. However, we'll leave that for another time, and we'll come back to heaven and earth with the gospel for today, the first day of Lent. From Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "Take care not to perform righteous deeds in order that people may see them. Otherwise, you will have no recompense from your heavenly Father. When you give alms, do not blow a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets to win the praise of others. Amen, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right is doing. In that your almsgiving may be secret, and your Father who sees it in secret will repay you. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, who love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that others may not you. They have received the reward. But when you pray, go to your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will repay you. When you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites. They neglect their appearance so that they may appear to others to be fasting. Amen, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you may not appear to be fasting, except to your Father who is hidden. And your Father who sees what is hidden will repay you. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much, Heidi, for joining us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.